Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending upon where you have joined from. And welcome to another webinar from Data Platform Geeks. Today, our topic is on Azure Data Studio and SQL Server 2019 Big Data Cluster by Niels Berglund, who is an MVP from South Africa. This webinar is a continuation of the webinar that was delivered on Tuesday on SQL Server 2019 Big Data Cluster. In this webinar, Niels will do a brief overview of Azure Data Studio and followed by a deep dive into how you can use Azure Data Studio for deploying and managing SQL Server 2019 Big Data Cluster. And my name is Satya Ramesh, and I will be the host for you for next 1 hour. And Aarti Nambiar is helping me with moderation. Before we continue, a quick word about who we are and what we do. We work for eDominer Systems, under which we have a couple of brands, SQLMaestros, under which we have a lot of advanced trainings on SQL Server and Microsoft Data Platform and artificial intelligence related technologies called masterclasses. And we do have a couple of self-paced learning solutions called learning kits and hands-on labs. Recently, we are coming up with video courses on SQL Server performance tuning and T-SQL querying and programming, which I'll talk about them a bit later. And we also have a famous SQL Server health check service also. Peopleware India, which is our corporate training unit, and we also have a ERP product called Expand SM ERP. Today, our concentration is on Data Platform Geeks and SQL Server Geeks communities, which were founded by Amit Bansal in the year 2010, under which we do a lot of free in-person events and webinars as well. And once in a year, we do annual summit called Data Platform Summit 2019. So here is the picture of recently concluded Data Platform Summit 2019, where 1,000 plus people from 300 plus companies attended this summit who have traveled down to Bangalore from 20 different countries. And there are more than 100 plus sessions delivered by 50 plus speakers. Again, they have traveled down from 16 different countries. If you're serious with data platform and artificial intelligence related technologies, this summit is a must attend for you. If you wish to learn more about Data Platform Summit, you can visit dps10.com, or else you can simply drop an email to contact@dps10.com. Here is a picture of Data Platform Geeks team and eDominer teams on DPS 2019 stage. Here is the team, DPG core team, Amit Bansal, who is a founder and president, Manohar Punna, who is a vice president, and you can see all other regional mentors across many cities in India and outside India as well. And here are the eDominer teams which will help us to execute these free events and webinars. And special thanks to Microsoft, who is helping us to organize these community events. You are a member of Data Platform Geeks, remain as a member. Please whitelist Data Platform Geeks domain and add events@dataplatformgeeks.com to your address book, so you won't miss out any of our updates about upcoming events and free resources. So if you join today's event by using a direct joining link, please register as a member so that you will be able to get access to the resources that will be uploaded after today's webinar as well. So beyond this webinar, if you have any questions, you can join our social groups, Facebook group, LinkedIn group, and we also have a group on Telegram as well. And here are the links to our YouTube channels. All the webinars are recorded, and we will be uploading these webinars in SQL Server Geeks YouTube channel. And we also record free videos on SQL Server performance tuning, T-SQL, and querying. We do upload them under SQLMaestros YouTube channel. Again, here is the link for Telegram channel. So before handing it over to Niels, I have a couple of questions. So I'm launching the poll right now. So here are the questions on the poll. First question is, how many of you are already using SQL Server Big Data Cluster? And the second question is, how many of you are using Azure Data Studio? So these are the two questions. Please put up your response there. I'll wait for a couple of seconds for you to respond. The first question is, how many of you are using SQL Server 2019 Big Data Cluster? And second question is, how many of you are already using Azure Data Studio? Just waiting for a few more responses. Yes, here are the results. For the first question, 89% of people not using SQL Server Big Data Cluster. And for the second question, 74% of the people are not using Azure Data Studio. So over to you, Niels.
Welcome, guys. My name is Niels Berglund. I'm presenting today about Azure Data Studio and big data cluster. I hope that all of you can see my screen now. We have here where a title Azure Data Studio and 2019 Big Data Cluster. If you can't see, please shout, but I'll go on as we speak. So as I said, my name is Niels Berglund. I'm based out of Durban, South Africa. I'm working as a software architect at an online gaming company called Derico. We are headquartered here in Durban, and we have offices basically all over the world. Satya said, I'm an Microsoft Data Platform MVP, and I'm working quite closely with Microsoft around SQL Server. I've started with SQL Server way back when it was version 4.2, and then I've sort of stayed with SQL Server up until now, and including SQL Server 2019. Anyway, so today we're talking about Azure Data Studio and how we can deploy and manage big data clusters using Azure Data Studio. And the agenda looks something like this. We're given a brief overview of Azure Data Studio. We'll talk a little bit about notebooks, what notebooks are, what you can do with them. Then we will dive down and look at how we are using Azure Data Studio to deploy a big data cluster. And finally, we will look at how we can manage and troubleshoot a big data studio using Azure Data Studio. So that's more or less what we're doing today. This presentation will be fairly much demo/code driven. I do have slides, but I'll try to not use so much slides. Okay. Right, so there were quite a few of you in the poll that, so more than half, 74-75% of you guys and girls have not used, are not using Azure Data Studio. And well, my assumption is that if you are using SQL Server and you're not using Azure Data Studio, then you're probably using SQL Server Management Studio, the good old SSMS. And I don't blame you for not using Azure Data Studio. It kind of, ADS kind of snuck up on us. It was initially, Microsoft had a tool called SQL Operations Studio, a really stupid name. If we abbreviate it, it will be SOS, and who wants to do that anyway? That was later renamed to Azure Data Studio because lately, the last couple of years, everything that Microsoft is doing has to have the name Azure in it. Well, I don't know if that is true or not, but it seems that way. So Azure Data Studio ADS is a data tool. So whereas SQL Server Management Studio basically only dealt with SQL Server, you could only query SQL Server from SQL Server Management Studio. ADS is a data tool. In other words, you can query SQL Server. You can query SQL Server. You can also do queries against Postgres, for example. And you have support for big data through HDFS, through the Hadoop file system. The other big difference between Azure Data Studio and Management Studio is that Azure Data Studio is cross-platform. You can run it on Windows. Well, it would be strange if you couldn't, seeing that this is Microsoft after all, but you can also run it on Mac and Linux. The ADS is based upon Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code is the Microsoft's open source code editor for a lot of different development languages, .NET, Java, Python, R, what have you. It's kind of a modern, ADS is kind of a modern tool. You have IntelliSense, as you would expect. You have keyword completions. You can create code snippets. There are both built-in existing code snippets, and you have the capability to create your own code snippets. And in addition to all this, you also have source control integration through Git. So if you have source control either on an on-prem Git repository, or if you're using GitHub, GitLab, what have you, you have integration through ADS into your repositories, which is really, really cool, actually. The Azure Data Studio is, since it is built upon Visual Studio Code, it is fairly lightweight. And when you're downloading the install file for Azure Data Studio, it weighs in at around 80, 90 meg. And that is, I mean, that is nothing in today's world. If you're looking at SQL Server Management Studio, that sits at 500-600 meg at least. Since it is based upon VS Code, it has more or less the same release cadence as VS Code has. So you are getting frequent releases, and they are, well, more or less one release per month. A cool thing with ADS is that you have a built-in terminal. So by default, you can you have support for PowerShell, but you can also, if you have other terminal applications, you can also use them in the built-in terminal in ADS. As I said, it is open source. And the great thing with ADS is that it has support for themes. So if you have your favorite IDE theme, you can use that in ADS. Finally, it is extensible. So even though it may not have as much features out of the box, you can, through extensions, enable a lot of really, really nice features, and we will have a look at that in a minute or two. If we compare ADS and Management Studio, the ADS is not, and I repeat that, it is not a replacement for Management Studio. Management Studio can do quite a lot of things that ADS cannot do. And that is specifically, well, that is more in the DBA space. So SSMS has a lot of functionality features catering to DBAs, and ADS do not have that, basically. Certain things, though, ADS is catching up upon. So initially you didn't have ADS didn't have a profiler, you didn't have an import wizard, etc., etc. That is now in ADS, or it is there through extensions. So once again, if we are comparing ADS with SSMS, I said that ADS was very lightweight. That is definitely not the case with SSMS. Management Studio, you can't call it lightweight in any shape or form. And ADS runs under 64-bit. Management Studio runs under 32 bits. And basically, it is hard to write extensions for Management Studio. I have tried a couple of times, and yeah, you can do it, but it's not easy. It's not, SSMS is not easily extendable. Right. Let's have a look at the layout. So when I did my last webinar on Tuesday, I had a problem when I was switching from presentation mode into code mode. Let's see if it goes better this time. So now you guys should see here Azure Data Studio up on the screen. I hope, if you can't, please shout. Anyway, so the layout is that we have, so here where I'm now moving my, actually let's do it this way. Where I'm moving my mouse, we now have, this is sort of the editor part. And then we have where here we have like server connections, etc., a toolbar. We have a status bar, etc., and we can also bring up the terminal. Open new terminal, or not. That was interesting. That was not what I had expected. Let's just try something here. So just executed a query here. I'm just trying to get the terminal up and running. Let me do this. Sorry, guys. The demo devil hits again. Let's close down ADS and bring it back up. So while I'm waiting for ADS to come back up, let's just then have a look at on this slide where we're now seeing the editor part. We're seeing the sidebar, the activity bar, status bar, and we have a panel, right? Let's go back to there and that doesn't seem to work. Anyway, trust me, there is a terminal, and maybe it will decide to pop up a little bit later on. Anyway, let's get on with this. But so once again, so we have you have your editor part here. Here you have the sidebar where you can see what servers you have connections to. You have the activity bar here, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And down here we have a controller for SQL Server big data clusters, and we will talk a little bit more about that in a second. Right, cool. Let's move on. So the extensions, as I said, so that's the way whereby we can add functionality to Azure Data Studio. There are extensions written by Microsoft, and there are extensions written by third-party developers, and it is fairly easy to write an ADS extension. So if you have something that ADS is not supporting, well, go ahead, write an extension for it. And you can then, you have a marketplace for extensions where you can upload your extensions to this marketplace, and they become available for anyone using ADS. Let's go back and have a look here at extensions. All right. So if you look here, so this little where we're having four rectangles, one a little bit outside of the others, is where you can see extensions. And as you can see now on the screen, on the left-hand side here, we have enabled extensions. So those are the extensions that I have right now installed. And here you can see I have an extension for data virtualization. which allows you to create external tables against remote data sources. And I have an SQL Server import extension where it gives me an import wizard. So if you have a text file or a CSV file, you can import that into your SQL Server through a wizard-like dialog, right, where you decide what file do you want to import, what database should the import go to, what should the table name be called that that supports this, that the data will be imported into. And then you have a lot of uninstalled extensions here. And I would like to show you something here where let's connect to a database. So here is now the connection part. So if you didn't see that, let's click out of here again. So I clicked here, connect, right? And here I have some connections that I have used before. This one, S2K19, etc. That is the connection to my big data cluster up in Azure Kubernetes Service. And you can see down here the connection details, right? So we have a connection type. The server we are connecting to, the username SA, and I have given it a name, as you can see at the very bottom there. Right, so let's connect up here and let's connect to my Niels database. And I have here in my database, I have a table called TB_demo vote. So this is a table that has election results from, I think it was the 2012 US election from a couple of states. And if we are looking at that table, select top 100 star from DBO TB, and as you see here now, as I code along, I'm getting my IntelliSense, etc. that we are, as we expect from a modern IDE. And now in here we can see the results. We have an ID, we have a longitude, latitude, we have an abbreviation for a state, what county it is, population, what have you. The thing where I'm going with all this is that ADS has a built-in visualizer, or basically a chart tool. So when I click here, right, you should see that little thing looking like a bar graph. If I click on that, my result will now be charted, right? And I can choose what type of chart I want here, etc., etc., etc. And if you see down at the bottom, when I clicked on that chart button, I see something here, a dialog comes up. Azure Data Studio has extension recommendations for data visualization, etc., etc. Show recommendations. Let's click on show recommendations, and here at the right-hand side, we can now see we have a recommendation for something called Sandance. Sandance is something that Microsoft Research came up with, where they are using AI and machine learning to inspect a result and then create very nice graphical representation of the data. Much better looking than that out of the box graph that we just saw. So just to show extensions, let's click install here. And it now goes out, installs. We can see So when we are clicking on it, we are getting some information about this this extension, and what a little bit examples what we can do with it. And now I have here, once the installation has finished, we can see it is installed. Cool. Let's go back to here and do a select star from demo vote. Run this query. And while it's running, it's quite a, it's quite a few records in there. While it's running, notice here on the right-hand side, so under my that graph thing I had, I now have a new icon, which, I don't know what it looks like. It's like it looks like a window with some bars in it. Anyway, that's the Sandance extension. So if I click now here on this visualizer, this will now take a little while, half a minute, whereby this extension now goes in and interrogates this the result and tries to come up with a visualization of that result. And we are almost there. Let's wait a couple of seconds more. And it has now done the actual interrogation, inspection, and it now loads in the result into the canvas. And now we can see a scatter plot of that result. And this looks, what does this look like? Well, it looks like a map, and it looks like a map of United States. And which it is, and then if we go in here and click somewhere or look at something, if you can now see here, we're now seeing an ID, we're seeing longitude, latitude. We can drill down into this result. We can change here the result, the graph to a bar chart, sorry, and let's make it 3D. And let's change the, just take something here. We're saying that the Z axis should now be longitude, and can now see how the graph is changing. So this is, if you want to analyze data, this is a really cool tool in order to get visualizations of your data. And as I said, if we're clicking here, we can click down into here, drill down into the result on that particular individual point, so that individual data point, right? Cool. So this was just an example of extensions. And once again, when you look here in my ADS, I have here 3 extensions: the data virtualization, the Sandance, and the import. Right? So if you are using ADS, or if you're thinking about using ADS, please have a look at the extensions, but because there's a lot of cool things that you can do with these extensions, and they definitely help your productivity. All right, back to the slide deck. So we've spoken about Azure Data Studio extensions, right? Now then, so that's kind of that was kind of the overview of ADS. Now let's talk about something called Jupyter Notebook. And Jupyter Notebook is something that a data scientist probably is aware of, or at least have been working with a little bit. Yeah. Let's. So a notebook is, well, it's essentially a web application, where you can create and you can share documents through this web application. And Jupyter is something that is built upon the Iron Python project, open source, and a document in a notebook. You have Markdown, where you can now write stuff in the Markdown format. You can have code, and the notebook also, you may now ask, so okay, so what's different from just a query window where you are writing some text and you're writing some code? Well, the thing here is that the notebook can also contain results and visualization. So if you are executing something in a notebook, the result will now stay with the notebook until you decide to clear out the result. This is very, very cool if you want to do some sort of analysis of data. The notebooks has a standard format called IPYNB, Iron Python Notebook. And well, the document, as I say, is human readable and it is executable. But some concepts of a notebook is that the document, the actual notebook, contains of cells. So you are working in a cell in the notebook, and what you can do in that cell is either to write text, as I said, in the Markdown format, or you can write code. And then when you execute that cell, well, the result will appear. And the question is now, how do we know what to execute, right? So notebook is, as I said, used by data scientists quite a lot. And if I now write Python code, or I can write Python code, I can write R code, how does the notebook, how does this underlying application know what to execute? Well, it knows that by the fact that we have a parsers, or kernels, as it's called. So you have parsers, kernels for multiple languages, amongst them Python. You also have for Spark, SQL, etc. And there are companies that creates viewers and editors on top of these Jupyter notebooks. And Microsoft is one of those companies. In Azure Data Studio, Microsoft decided to include a notebook functionality. So when you have an IPYNB file, the Jupyter notebook file, you can open that in an ADS as it would be a normal SQL file. And what Microsoft has done here is that they have embedded the Jupyter engine under the covers in ADS, and have also built a presentation layer on top of the Jupyter engine. The other thing that Microsoft did was that they enhanced the SQL kernel, the SQL parser. So you now have, in a notebook, you can now write queries against your SQL servers exactly as you would write queries in Management Studio. So let's have a look at that, shall we? And go into ADS here. And let's do something like this. File, new notebook. Cool. As you can see here now, I have notebook, and then we can, you also see that up at the top, we're attached to, okay, so here we can now select the connection, and we also have, we also have here kernel, right? And when I click here in the drop down, we can see that I have various kernels now. I have SQL, PySpark, Spark, Python, and PowerShell. So these are all now parsers for these underlying languages. Right, so let's select a connection. Actually, let's add some text here first. So we're saying hi and welcome to notebooks. Right. So this is now the text, and as you see, once again, that I'm using Markdown format. So this here indicates an H1 H1 title. We can write some code. So we're saying add code, and we're doing select star from sys databases. Right. Cool. I haven't. Let's click execute, and now my connection dialog pops up. I'm saying connect, and now I've connected. My query is running. We can see that through that circle spinning, and they are telling me I'm stupid because I can't spell. So let's try again. And here we now have the result, right? So once again here, the cool thing now with this, or the interesting thing with this, is that this result now stays with the notebook. So you can easily now, so let's say you have an issue with in your SQL Server or wherever, you're running a query to try to figure out what it is, or you're running a query where you don't get the result you expect. You can now take this notebook and email that to someone else that can help you to figure out what is going wrong, for example. Right? Cool. Let's go on with this a little bit. And so we're coming back then to what use do we have on notebooks in ADS, right? So we can use it for teaching materials, for example. So I'm running one-day classes about big data clusters and other stuff. And most of my material is now created as notebooks. We can use it as deployment guides, and we will see that in a bit. We can share and collaborate, and it's really, really useful to if you want to work together with other people. It is a little bit, if you are used to Management Studio, it's a little bit strange because there are certain things that do not you can't do in a notebook that you're doing in Management Studio. So, for example, if you're having now code like this, right? Select star from whatever. Normally in Management Studio, you would highlight, you can, if you want to, you can highlight one of the rows here and then just execute, right? Or do it like that. That is not possible in the ADS implementation of notebooks at this stage. Hopefully, you can do it in Jupyter Notebooks through the web application. At the moment, you can't do it in ADS implementation of notebooks, but that is hopefully something that will come fairly soon. All right, cool. So that was now we know, now we have seen ADS, we have seen a little bit about notebooks. Let's now go in and have a look at how do we deploy a big data cluster using ADS. So for you who didn't attend my webinar on Tuesday, I said in that webinar that deploying a big data cluster is nothing like what we are used to. Is nothing like we are used to when we are deploying normal, let's call it normal SQL Server. So, and as I used to say, we are not in Kansas anymore, right? This is completely different. And normally when we deploy a SQL Server, we download an ISO file, we right-click on the ISO file, or we are using command line, we are mounting it, and we click on Startup, and it installs. Not so with a big data cluster. A big data cluster is based upon Python scripts. So when we are deploying a big data cluster, we are executing Python scripts. And there are two ways we can do it. We can either do it manually from command line, sorry, excuse me, or we can use Azure Data Studio to, under the covers, execute these Python scripts. So when we are using the ADS to deploy a big data cluster, we have wizards for this, where we are setting up where to deploy it to. Should it be a new Azure, or should it be a new Kubernetes environment? Should it be an existing Kubernetes environment? How many nodes do we want to have, etc., etc., etc. And when we have run through the deployment wizard, this now creates a deployment notebook, and we then executes that notebook. So, and that will then cause the actual deployment and installation of a big data cluster. So let's go and have a look at that. So actually, cancel out of there. So I already have a big data cluster set up. I will not deploy a new big data cluster because it takes a while. You can, when I deploy it, I'm counting on like an hour's deployment time. That sounds a lot. Well, it is a lot if you compare with a normal SQL Server installation, but don't forget that this is not only SQL Server here in a big data cluster. It is just a very, very minimal part of the whole big data cluster. You have compute pools, you have storage pools, you have Apache Spark, you have HDFS, you have a lot of Kibana, Elasticsearch, InfluxDB, a lot of things. So an hour in the grand scheme of things is probably not that much. But anyway, so if you were to deploy use ADS to deploy a big data cluster, you would, if we're looking here up at the, if we're looking up here at the screen, you see this connections thing and how we now have 3 dots here. This is kind of what you are using. So let's click on that, and we're getting here deploy SQL Server. How cool is that? We click on that, and now we're coming into a deployment wizard where we have different options. We can deploy SQL Server on Windows. We can deploy a SQL Server Docker container, or we can deploy SQL Server Big Data Cluster. And also, as you can, if you see here at the bottom, or well, middle of the screen, we can see that it's saying that I have some tools missing if I wanted to install a Docker container. And well, what's missing is Docker. But as we don't want to, as I'm not going to deploy a Docker container here, we want to deploy a SQL Server Big Data Cluster instead. And now it will load stuff. We see now here that I have the options here. What version of SQL Server do I want to deploy? Well, the only version I have available for this is SQL Server 2019. And it asks what deployment target, where do I want to deploy it to? And we have some options here now: a new Azure Kubernetes Service Cluster, existing Azure Kubernetes cluster, or a normal bog standard existing Kubernetes cluster, which is would basically mean that we are deploying it on-prem or to some other cloud provider, i.e. AWS or Google Cloud, or where you have an Kubernetes cluster. There are some tools required to do this, and fortunately, I do have all these tools available. You can see kubectl, Azure CLI, and AZ Data, and all 3 are installed, which is cool. We're clicking select. Now, what I'm getting here, a configuration template dialog where I, come on. So this loads, this is supposed to load from my local machine. Essentially, what you do here is that you are selecting the configuration that you want. And seeing that we have an issue with that right now. Okay, here we go. So we're having two configurations out of the box. You have the Azure Community Service dev test, that is the default, and then you have dev test with high availability. And you are seeing here basically now how many instances do you want, how much storage do you want, etc., etc. Cool. I click next. This data that you put in here or you choose, that is now saved, and it will be used a little bit later on. Here we're now setting the what should I deploy to, or the settings for Azure. So we're saying here that use my default subscription. We can create a resource group. What data center do I want to deploy to? What do I want the cluster to be named? And then how many virtual machines do I want? And what should the virtual machines sizes be? We just keep, so if you are to, by the way, if you are to deploy this either through the Python scripts or Azure Data Studio, be aware that you need to ensure that the VM size you choose, if you are deploying it to Azure, that will give you the necessary amount of hard drives. So a big data cluster requires at least 24 hard drives available where they are setting up persistent volumes and what have you for this. Why I'm mentioning this is that a VM on Azure has a number of hard drives, and that is based upon how many cores the VM has. So look out for that. So ensure that you're choosing enough VMs so you're getting up to at least 24 hard drives. Cool. We are continuing. We set the cluster name. We are setting an administrator username, a password, authentication mode basic. We are we're entering some. We're entering some password here. The password needs to match the standards for secret passwords or for password complexity. Right, and a word of warning, please remember the password that you set. I have done this a couple of times and I've forgotten the password, and then I'm kind of have to start all over again. That is not fun, trust me. Bummer. Item saying that it's the wrong password. Cool. Finally, we're now getting to service settings. We're saying how many master instances do I want, how many compute pool, etc., etc., etc. And we're clicking next, and we're getting basically a summary of what I'm doing. And down here we can now see the storage settings. Sorry, we can see the storage settings, how many controllers, etc., etc., etc. Cool. That is now has been scripted. This will now be scripted to a notebook, right? And I will cancel out of here. But what I'll do is I will now go and take a notebook that I used to do this deployment, so you can see what it looks like. So hang on a second while I'm trying to find that file. Right. So here, so when you click script to notebook, this is the end result. Create the Azure Kubernetes Service Cluster and deploy we are checking the prerequisites. That's cool. The notebook is doing some import for Python stuff. We are setting variables. So you see here now the notebook, right? How we are interleaving text with code, right? We are checking dependencies, required information, and then we're logging into Azure. We are setting the subscription for Azure. We're creating a resource group. We're creating the actual cluster. And then we are now creating down here, we are creating the SQL Server 2019 Big Data Cluster. And what you will see here that eventually you will see starting cluster deployment. We are waiting for the cluster controller. We are ready with the cluster controller, and finally we are getting successfully executed this deployment. So now we are up and running with my SQL Server data cluster. Cool. And that's how you're deploying, right? Something that I forgot to tell you about with the Azure Data Studio is the where I said it was a data tool, right? And we see that here. I'll come back to the big data cluster in a second. But we see that here now in the server pane, so database security and server objects. That's kind of that is similar to what you see in Management Studio. But what you never see in Management Studio is this. So this is now HDFS, the Hadoop file system, where you can create directories in the file system. You can upload data to the file system and then use, for example, external tables to select against against the Hadoop file system. And we spoke about that in my previous webinar last Tuesday. Anyway, right, cool. So deploying a big data cluster. We have talked about this. Yeah, we have spoken about this. We have spoken about this. So we now have my big data cluster deployed, right? How do I now manage and troubleshoot the big data cluster? Well, we can, in my, I said earlier that we had SQL Server big data cluster controllers, and the controller is something that allows you to manage your big data cluster. And that controller gives you information about the big data cluster. So we have the controller, and then we also have notebooks, built-in notebooks for troubleshooting a big data cluster. So let's have a look at that. So let's come back here to Azure Data Studio. You can see now here my controller that I have set up. You can add more controllers if you have multiple big data clusters. So you're getting an add controller dialog, etc., etc. I won't do anything with that because I have my big data cluster controller here. I can right click on manage, and now you see here we are now retrieving data from the big data cluster. We can see details here. What we have, the SQL Server, this is the master instance here. Here is for Hadoop file system, Spark, the control plane, gateway, applications, etc., etc., etc. If I click here on SQL Server, for example, I can now go in and look at metrics. I can look at logs. So look at SQL metrics, clicking view. Coming into, so this is now running on Grafana, Kibana, etc. Interesting. Right. So this is now Grafana, and here I now see metrics of my SQL Server. So you can choose here what nodes you want to look at metrics on, but master 0, that's the master instance of SQL Server. And you have a lot of information here: buffer caches, always on, weight statistics, etc., etc., etc. You get the same. Hello. You get the same if we go back to my controller and to the overview. You can see down here we have service endpoints, and here is now the external endpoints for the services in the big data cluster. So we were looking at the metrics dashboard here, but we can also look at the Kibana. So we are clicking here, and Kibana will come up in a second. So I said on Tuesday, and it's worth saying again, right? With a big data cluster comes Grafana, Kibana, Elasticsearch, InfluxDB, right? All out of the box. And Microsoft has added it in here so that we can easily manage and monitoring and look at data for our big data cluster. Right. And if you're used to Elastic and Kibana, what you will see here now should be fairly familiar to you guys. And you can do your normal now query filters in here by writing your queries in here for whatever you're interested in seeing. Right. So that is kind of how we are. That's kind of how we are managing my cluster, right? So what about then troubleshooting the cluster? Well, if you in here in big data, so SQL Server big data clusters, you can see up here at the almost at the very top, you see troubleshoot. Cool. So what I do is I click on troubleshoot, and now in the left hand side you see unsaved books. So this is now we're coming up to a home page. Let's call it a home page, the big data cluster troubleshooter, and where you have some information about what we can do here. But let's go down, and so here we're having we have various things. We're having troubleshooters, we're having log analyzers, we can do we can diagnose the cluster, we can look at various statuses. But what do we want to do? Look at the show BDC status, right? So I'm clicking on show BDC status, and my a notebook pops up, where when I run this, so we are defining some helper functions, right? We have created the functions, and now under the covers, on Tuesday I mentioned the AZ data tool, which you can run from, which you're running from command line. And under the covers here now, what ADS is doing in these notebooks is that they are executing, in this case, it's executing some AZ data commands. So let's run that. And it goes in now and starts to look at the stats of the cluster. And eventually it will come up while we're waiting for it to come back. We can okay, so interesting. I'm running at the moment an invalid token, so I get an error, and that is because I have not logged in through AZ Data, which is so I would need to log in here, do an AZ Data login first, and then this will work. I'm cognizant of time here, so we won't do that. But as you can see, what I'm once again, what these notebooks should give you a fairly good understanding about what goes on in your big data cluster. And you can, so for example, show HDFS status. Once again, it requires AZ data, and I haven't logged in. But you can get information about everything in your big data cluster through these notebooks. So that's how you're now maintaining and administering your big data cluster, all from Azure Data Studio. You don't really need to, all this here in the notebooks, as I said, those are command line commands, which you can run from a terminal or somewhere. And speaking of which, so remember that terminal I said. So now we have here the terminal. It is PowerShell, and I can now do whatever things I normally do in a terminal. So essentially, you could take these commands here and run them in terminal instead. But it's so much easier to doing it from a script, from a notebook, in my opinion. Right. Let's go back to the slides. The controller dashboard, notebooks, big data cluster, we looked at that, So to sum it up, so ADS is a cross-platform tool for handling data, both on-prem as well as Azure. Or, well, basically, you could use another cloud as well, but if you had SQL Server or Postgres there. We are adding functionality by having extensions, and we saw the Sandance extension, we saw the import extensions. And Jupyter Notebooks is documents that contains markdown code, visualizations, results, all interleaved in the document. Oh, and by the way, the notebook itself, we can have a look at that, what that looks like. So if I'm opening the notebook in a text editor, the notebook is essentially JSON. The notebook is essentially, let's get that back, shall we? The notebook is essentially just JSON stuff, interleaved with some HTML. So cell information, etc., etc., etc. It's not extremely straightforward to understand what the notebook is doing from the actual file. It is so much better to have an editor to do that. But anyway, we can run Python code, Spark code, we can run SQL code in the various notebooks. You can mix and match in the same notebook, but you would need to change kernel in between. So you start with SQL, then you want to do Spark, right? You're starting with the SQL kernel, then you're changing to the Spark kernel, etc., etc. And through ADS, through the BDC controller, and through the notebooks, you can manage your BDC cluster. And that was all I have. So I want to thank you guys and girls for attending, and a very, very warm thank you to the Data Platform Geeks, to Satya and all you guys running that. You're doing really cool stuff. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Niels. All of you, please put up your questions in the Q&A panel. And we have already posted a message, a thank you message in our LinkedIn account. So the link is available in chat window. Please post your comments there. That will encourage our speakers to come back and deliver free sessions for us. So the link will be there in chat window. And while you post your questions, I just have a couple of slides. And after that, Niels will take over the questions again. And beyond this webinar, if you still have any questions, you can use our Facebook group and LinkedIn group and our Telegram channels to post your questions. We'll forward that questions to Niels so that your questions will get answered. And as I already told you, like SQLMaestros is coming up with video courses on performance tuning and T-SQL querying and programming based upon master classes and master series. So video course is basically will contain more than 100 hours of content, which is comprehensive and advanced and deep dive expert level modules. And all these modules will be constantly updated based upon the updates released by Microsoft and bug fixes, etc. And the main advantage of subscribing to video course is that you can watch anytime, anywhere, and as many times as you can. So if you wish to learn more about SQLMaestros video courses, you can visit SQLMaestros.com, or else you can simply drop an email to contact@SQLMaestros.com. And hands-on labs is a project from SQLMaestros, which is a community project where if you subscribe to that, you will be provided with a lab document. In that, you'll get scripts and supporting explanations, observations, and screenshots, so that at the end of the lab, you'll be able to become an expert in that particular topic. So there are more than 100 plus labs available on SQL Server, Azure, Power BI, Analytics, Cosmos DB, Azure Data Warehouse, Azure SQL Database, etc. And close to 2,000 subscribers are already there. If you wish to learn more about hands-on labs, visit SQLMaestros.com, or else you can simply drop an email to contact@SQLMaestros.com. So here are the upcoming events, upcoming webinars. There are 5 more webinars in the December, and there are close to 5 webinars in January as well, and a couple of webinars in February as well already scheduled. If you go to dataplatformgeeks.com/events, you can find all the list of upcoming webinars. And thank you all. Thank you everyone for attending this webinar. And please don't forget to post your comments in LinkedIn. The link is available in chat window now. And I'm handing it over to Niels to take Q&A. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you, Satya. Cool. Okay, so I see some questions here. Awesome questions. Let's see if I can answer them. So first question, what is the bare minimum requirement to deploy a big data cluster? Well, as I said, regardless where you deploy it on, either in Azure Kubernetes Service or Azure on-prem, or or Kubernetes on-prem or Kubernetes on some other cloud provider, a minimum requirement is 24 hard drives. As far as, and a fairly beefy machine. There are I do not have the minimum requirements on machine sizes, but if you Google SQL Server Big Data Cluster, SQL Server 2019 Big Data Cluster, there should be some sizing requirements in the documentation there. The shortcut to open terminals, that is as well as I have failed to do, but Control-Shift-P opens the project, or rather the toolbox, and from there you can do open terminal, or you can do Control-Shift-C, that opens the terminal directly. Can we connect that to Jupyter Notebooks? I do not. Can you run Jupyter Notebooks from the terminal? Yes, you can. Please share this post. Link is a good resource. Thank you. I'll promise I'll upload the deck and the code as soon as we finish this, so you can go and have a look at it. What is the advantage of churning SQL Server 2019 BDC from ADS compared to Azure Web Application? That question I do not really understand. So if the question is, can I deploy an big data cluster through the Azure? My assumption is that is the portal. The answer is no. You can't deploy a big data cluster through the Azure portal. You can deploy or create a Kubernetes service through the portal, and then you can use Azure Data Studio to deploy to that particular Kubernetes cluster. In my examples that I did today, we saw how well, rather I created a Kubernetes cluster and deployed all in one go. Right. Cool. So follow up on that question, ping me directly or in the LinkedIn group. If I haven't answered good enough, I can we can try to take it there. I said that you mentioned that big data cluster can be deployed on Azure or AWS, Kubernetes. Will AWS be preferred or Azure is preferred platform? Okay, so what is preferred from a sense of managing the cluster? Obviously, Microsoft wants you to deploy to Azure, right? But from a management perspective, nothing really changes. You would get the same management experience if you deployed it to an AWS cluster as you would if you deploy it to an Azure cluster. The management experience doesn't really change. The important here a bit is the underlying big data cluster, right? Can we use streaming data from ADS to Power BI? Can I stream data from Azure Data Studio to Power BI? Let me come back to that one. I would, a while ago you couldn't. I do not know if there has been some changes in that recently. What you can do through Azure Data Studio is obviously to run Spark jobs, and potentially you could then have a sync being Power BI for, well, I don't know, but my assumption is that if you can, you could run a Spark job and syncing the data into Power BI. Cool. You're welcome, Indrait. So that's it for me, guys. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Niels. Thank you for your time. And please post, all of you, please post your comments in the LinkedIn post that you have given. And you still have questions, you can use our social channels to ask your questions. Thank you all. Thank you for joining.
Thanks, you guys. Cheers. Bye.